Thank you all for coming here. We are just a couple of minutes behind schedule, which is a good sign. The first item on the agenda is an overview of the project itself, and we begin by none other than our own John Camillus.
Thank you, Bopaya. So glad that so many of you could make it. Absolutely delighted to have you here. And this is a project that's been going on for some time, and when I said Bopaya and I are partners in crime, that's true. I think it goes back 7 or 8 years, and this is our 5th conference, really. And there's been a pattern there of evolution, which many of you have been part of over these many years. So I'd like to, point that out. There are some, I guess I have to be on my best behavior because there are a couple of funders in the room. Ty has been the Hillman Foundation is extraordinarily generous, along with the Beale Foundation, in supporting our projects. And Dawn is here not only as chair of the English department, but as chair of the YOHU, Year of the Humanities, let me call it by the proper name. And they are also supporting this, especially the panelists this afternoon. So delighted to have all of you here. In terms of this, this is the fundamental proposition. Alberta, you have a seat up front. The fundamental proposition is up here, and it's really rather simple and is becoming more credible, and I don't have to, in a sense, tense up when I talk about this to my colleagues, especially with all due apologies to Dr. Hingarani, who's a PhD in finance, my finance colleagues who are devotees of Milton Friedman, and sort of gave absolute primacy, if not sole primacy, to the shareholder. The argument that we have been making is that if you incorporate social benefit in the business model, as opposed to the traditional thing, which is after you make profits, providing some of the after-tax profits to good causes, you can actually not only increase social benefit, but you can actually enhance the bottom line. This was taken with several grains of salt and shrugs of indifference, if not antagonism, some years ago, but it's coming into its own in so many ways and with so many instances. And you being here is sort of an affirmation of the, I'm searching for the right word, of the appropriateness or worthiness of exploring this proposition. It's really fundamental because doing good is something all of us want to do. It's intrinsic. You look at the studies of values. Every society, there's an arc towards being better. But what we are trying to do here is accelerate the arc of being better by engaging companies who have responsibilities towards shareholders and showing them how we can all be better and also make a heck of a lot more money. And being in a business school, I don't see any conflict between those two. Okay. So it's a very simple and basic proposition which leads to the DC Heart Project. And there are two, and this you would like, Don, playing around with English here again. And the reason Bopaya and I, Christy had not yet joined the project and Louis had not, but Bopaya and I, when we thought of this name, the reason we thought humanity made sense apart from its intrinsic value was the fact that if you look at the definition of humanity, it's humaneness and humankind. And I'll just be very, very brief here because I can speak for hours on this. It's been something that I've been intrigued and interested in for 40 years now, which is the notion that profits by themselves are not an adequate measure of the attractiveness of strategic alternatives. Profits are a story that you put together to convince the board to give you money or investors to give you money. But the reality is something that may not be captured by that or reflected by, I know that. I've been engaged in this profession. Some people call it a racket for decades. And I know what profit projections are based on when you're talking about strategic and very different alternatives. But what we can say without hesitation is that if a project adheres to the notion of safety, where is Francis? There you go. Francis wrote a case for us on Alcoa in Russia. And the dominant consideration for Alcoa in terms of making profits is focusing on safety. Quality adds money to the bottom line. Sustainability, even gender equality, I can go into great depth about that, has been shown to impact the bottom line positively. Diversity, social sustainability, even Walmart has bought into the impact of environmental sustainability on the bottom line. So if a project has these characteristics, it's likely to be beneficial also from an economic value added perspective. And the second point about humankind, when you're talking about growth here, we're talking about 2 to 4% growth. 4% is a dream that Jeb Bush is putting forward, but 2% is closer to the reality. So if you're talking about a 10% to 15% growth rate expectation of shareholders, you can't make it by just looking at the developed economies. And the money is out there. Who's that famous bank robber? I forget his name. But big one? No, not that. Willie Sutton, thank you. And Willie, thank you. Willie Sutton, there's a Willie Sutton rule in diagnosis, medical diagnosis. The most likely diagnosis is probably the correct one. We academics make a big deal about obvious stuff. But coming back to this, he was asked why he robbed banks, and he said that's because that's where the money is, right? And the money is not necessarily here. The growth is elsewhere. You're talking about 4 billion people who are unserved, who have a purchasing power. This, you got to sit down. The first time I heard this, I could not believe it. Who have $5 trillion to $13 trillion of purchasing power. Okay, this is an unimaginable amount of money out there for the taking. So you put humaneness and humankind together, they constitute the notion of humanity, which is our driving force. Bopaya, I know I'm going a little longer than I should, but let me see if I can speed things up. Not going to go through the slide. This is basically what I've been talking about, but Barbara has been telling us you need to put more figures and diagrams on our slides. So I just put this up here in one slide just to show you the kind of support that exists. We're talking about GE, if you're talking about Immelt, you're talking about Rockwell and Don Beal. If you're talking about a whole bunch of major CEOs, you're talking about Michael Porter, who gave us credibility. Because if Michael Porter says this is true, it has to be, right? If Bopaya and John say it's true, it doesn't have to be so. But Michael Porter says it's true. And even Jeffrey Pfeffer has come out. It's been a cover of Newsweek. It's sort of, and this notion of building a better, happy company, if he had said that, we would have been laughed out. But if you're the chairman of a very large company, you can say that and get away with it. And they all say it adds to the bottom line. We had two objectives when he started out 7, 8 years ago. Building theory about this, and building and improving management practice by demonstrating that this is true. And as our dean said yesterday, that's something that a professional school needs to worry about. How do we affect what people do differently 9 o'clock Monday morning? That has to be part of our consideration. When Jerry Zoffer and Andy Blair recruited me for the school, they said, despite my educational background, which is somewhat more pragmatic than they usually like, they said, despite my academic background, they thought I had a future here. And maybe it's worked out, Jerry and Andy. Thank you. And the school is now giving importance to the notion of what impact does our research have. So I don't feel like an outsider anymore, though you did make me feel like one when I started. But you know, I was kidding, right? They're our closest friends. But coming back here, in terms of the core programs, I sort of reorganized the way Bopaya and I originally put it together. But we have case studies, development case studies. And the very first video case study we have, the target person is sitting right in front, Ashok, who's a multitasker. As it shows on his record, which we'll talk about. But he runs a whole bunch of organizations which essentially adhere to this, and I'll come back to this when I introduce them later. But we have a whole series of case studies. We have focused on curriculum development conferences. We'll talk about each of these in detail, the global community of knowledge, which we are building based on our previous conference in Prague, and the demonstration projects, which is the focus of today, the DC Heart Project. But in terms of case studies development, let me pass through the slide. It's a whole bunch of organizations globally that demonstrate this. And for instance, Chris, you were there when Pedro Suarez said this, right? He said he's the president of Dow Latin America. And he said for him, sustainability is strategy. And when somebody asked him, can he make money with that kind of notion? It turned out that he has the most profitable territory in Dow worldwide. So these are fascinating, very carefully selected companies. And where's Chandramohan? We have been detailing some of these, which will be out. Put in a plug for our book too, right? Yeah. Our Business of Humanity book, which Bopaya, Chandramohan, and I are writing, which should be out one of these days, has many of these case studies developed in detail. in terms of curriculum development, the course that Bopaya and I are most proud of is the Business of Humanity course, which we try to make credible by providing a very, very academic subtitle. We say strategic management in the era of globalization, innovation, and shared value, which makes it look really terrific. Which is just at Business of Humanity. And it's a very highly subscribed course in the business school and gets very highly rated. And it's been offered here and in Brazil and in India and has been extraordinarily successful in every location. It's been offered in a variety of formats, as a 3-credit elective, as a part of a global forum, as a project course involving projects in international countries. So that's something that came out of this project and is extraordinarily successful. In terms of why we are looking at DC current, well, I'll come to that right now, but we are addressing these fundamental challenges and the intersections of these challenges which create wicked problems, basically. And we are seeing how to handle this with BOH strategies through frugal engineering, co-creation of value, and planning processes that work from, this seems obvious, but it's not the way it's done, from a vision backwards as opposed to from the past forwards, which is what all of us tend to do. So technologies to do that is what we are working on. This, just to show you that this has added a lot. I mean, this is Bopaya's specialty in particular. We are working a lot on frugal engineering, and this is important because our DC Hut project here, it's expensive. Thank you, Ty. But we are able to afford it. Okay? We can't replicate the same thing elsewhere. We have to frugally re-engineer it to a fifth or a tenth of the cost in order for it to work in other contexts. And there are technologies to do that, and we have the competence, I think, to be from the industrial engineering department in particular to be able to do that. So these are the list of courses that relate to the business of humanity. And in terms of the conferences, this is the fifth, but the fourth one was a real watershed. And many people had an impact on it. I don't see Elvin around here. But after our third conference, he was a reporter with the Post-Gazette, and he said, you're talking about all these great things you're doing in other places. How about back home here? And he's from Homewood. So we started looking at Homewood, and something I'll come back to later, again, when introducing Alberta. But it led to being connected with John, without whom we could not be doing many of these things. But that fourth conference was extraordinarily important, and I hope this will be of the same nature, where we looked at DC technology for a bunch of reasons I'll come to in a second. Christy said a really fancy conference up there, right? This is a magnificent hotel in Prague. Everybody came. Nobody dropped out of that conference. So many of you were there. But it was magnificent, but it was magnificent content-wise, because what it did was gave us the plan for the last 3 years. So many of you are here who are at Prague too, and you see how we have followed up and been true to everything that came up in Prague, and even that the greenhouse in Homewood, the original idea was Prague. You were there, Kanu, and John, and Steve Ross of UEC, and Christy, and Bopaya decided to build this solar DC-powered greenhouse, an absolutely iconic entity in Homewood, which the origins were from the Prague conference. And this global community of knowledge, which is why Sri is here, for example. He runs the low voltage DC forum in India. We hope to get connected globally in terms of the work we are doing. And the demonstration projects, maybe I'll come to this in a second, but basically the community of knowledge is what we are building. And we have kept in touch and been benefited by so many of you who are at Prague. And Christy, do you want to maybe share what we are doing in terms of the websites and so on? She's the one taking care of that, so I don't want to display my technological incompetence.
So the site that we, this is our Business of Humanity site. This will be something that we, right now we have a lot of videos and information. Really a recent video with Arvind and the Business of Humanity. We also have a lot of talks from Prague on this site as well. And this is really kind of our home base for our project. Okay. Whoops.
If you click on DC, will you go there?
Should. So that was, Where's the, yeah, there we go. Found it. There's a lot of things to put down here. Okay, so this is the site that we're going to be launching next week. This is our DC Heart site, Humanity, Energy, and Regional Transformation. And this has been in development throughout the year. And one of the things John talked about is the forum, which we hope to set up. We have a base for it here, and we're going to ask people to sign up for it. And we're really hoping that we could start a global conversation about the DC project. So we're pretty excited about that. There's a blog that we've started on this board with the help of John Lipinski, John over there, and we have set it up so people can comment on the blog, and that's another way that we want to have a conversation. A big part of what we have on this site is a DC virtual home tour, and this is something that we developed earlier in the year, and we're pretty excited about it. This is just a small sample, just for time. I'll just show this one. The purpose of this, you tour through the whole home, but this doorbell in particular, why I'm bringing it up is because Professor Ad Van Wyck, he's from the Technical University of Delft, and actually in Prague is when he did a whole beginning presentation about a doorbell, and why it is such an energy waster. And so we thought that was so fascinating. So we had this idea of, it was a German of an idea of how can we think about things that we use every day, things in a home, how can we make them more energy efficient? So something as simple as a doorbell that you change out. And so we have examples of DC doorbells and things like that. So
Do you want to go inside?
yeah, I'll just show a room here and there. You can go inside. This is the kitchen, and you can navigate around. Coffee maker, dishwasher. You click on an item, and it'll give you some examples of if there's any DC products available out there. And for some of these, there aren't yet. So we see that as a real opportunity for people to say, hey, this would be a really great thing if it was accessible. So how can we make that accessible? So we see it as a fun educational tool, but also something that can get a conversation started. So that's something that we welcome you to do. And so basically that site is going to launch next week, and we welcome you to check it out and hopefully be a part of the forum and look at the virtual home and read the blogs, and we hope to get the conversation continuing from the conference.
Thanks, Chris.
Try to be quick.
No, that is terrific. So, I'm going to bypass this model, but this is, again, I pretend at being academic to show there's a basis for what you're doing. But I do want to talk about this because this is not an accidental thing. I mean, Bopaya and I had some interesting is a polite term, conversation about DC. But the reason we are doing this is in the third conference, Ashok was, Dr. Junjanwala, who was working on communications in rural areas, actually, he said, the job is done. When he started, there were 10 million phones in India. Now his goal was 100 million, but they're selling 17 million cell phones a month in India. So aspirations fulfilled, right? Total, but 17 million a month additional. So his job was done there, so he shifted his focus to rural electrification. The government claims that every home is electrified. If you have a light bulb in a village, they say the village is electrified. That was the formal definition of electrification. But he started working on that. He said, I'm working on DC, and he told us why. And being engineers of my vintage and somewhat less ancient Bopaya, we didn't believe in DC. We had grown up on AC. But he talked about it. Then in Europe, we discovered there's a whole entity looking at, and a bunch of companies looking at DC for middle-class homes. And they come back to Pittsburgh and Universal Electric. They couldn't make it today. They got a big contract for a sale, so both of them said, we've got to make money. So they're out there doing that. But in a sense, I remember John Dixon talking to me about the DC aspirations for the biggest consumer of power these days, computer data centers. And before I pass the baton to Bopaya, who has not yet told me do this, which he normally does. but it's basically, I wanted to say the DC power project that we have is really the demonstration, the first demonstration project for the validity of a fundamental proposition. And in terms of the BOH strategies that Chandramo and Bopaya and I are talking about, there are some fundamental characteristics that are important. One is, Christians didn't like this, but it's a popular term in business. You need BHAGs, big, hairy, audacious goals. Okay? And this is true. That's what promotes innovation. So Homewood is a big, hairy, audacious goal for us, and it's promoting an enormous amount of innovation, as so many of you could vouch for. It has to be global. I talked about that, but global is not only the attraction of the money, the Willie Sutton theory, but also reverse innovation. There are people, gurus like Clayton Christensen and, of course, Jeffrey Immelt, and the whole of GE has bought into this. They have redesigned their management systems in order to motivate innovation and reverse innovation from the emerging economies. So we say if you want to do a BOH strategy, you have no option but to be global and take advantage of this. And the disruptive technology, I mean, in a sense, what we are saying is with Bopaya's help in particular, we're taking disruptive technologies and converting them into innovative business models as opposed to throwing up our hands and saying we are dead. Okay. So, and this is Skunk Works, you're the Skunk Works. At the core of most of these innovations, it's a positive term. It's not as bad as it seems. It's the Lockheed term for the entity that created the finest airplanes ever in the world, right? We could call it a super team, but this is a Skunk Works that's driving this. And with that, I mean, it's a bit hokey, but hokiness makes you remember it, right? So we're talking about DC essentially being the BOH, base of the BOH strategies that we're trying to work on. And we went through most of these, so I'm just not going to go into too much detail because Bopaya will talk about it. But we are talking not, and this is something that's what's motivating him, the notion of rejuvenating a whole region. And in fact, through manufacturing, which is this very special shtick, so to speak. And we've come back and talk about this community in a box in more detail because in terms of the emerging economies, we have a notion there which we'll talk about. And when you use the word franchise, essentially we're talking about replication of microgrid technology, which of course, Steve, you're going to help us do, right? And we're going to steal the ideas from Ashok's projects in India. And one of the dreams we have, and between us friends here, I'm sort of reluctant to say it outside this context, but we hope that this will become the core of MBA curricula as we proceed. So I have two very major deans here, so I don't see any negative signs from them. And John Delaney was willing to say this on video, which is unusual for John to stick his neck out that far. But we have one video saying this is really important for an MBA curriculum. And I hope we will be able to convince Dean Assar that this is something that's important. HBS is committed to this. I got a newsletter just the other day where the dean is saying, use different words than us. We have registered, we trademarked the name Business of Humanity, so you couldn't use that. But that is the notion that's driving the evolution of their MBA curriculum. You're laughing at me, Bopaya, but I'm used to that. So may I pass the baton back to Bopaya to talk a little bit about the DC hard projects. Thanks.
Thanks, John. John has given me all of 5 minutes to talk to get back on schedule. So let me see if I can kind of make up a little bit of time there. And while John's talked about the vision of the project, we want to actually execute this vision in a couple of different ways. And our first local test site is Homewood. So we've got a couple of demonstration projects in Homewood. We want to be able, we are developing a couple of off-grid solutions in the community of Homewood for those outside of Pittsburgh that are not familiar with Homewood. Homewood used to be a wealthy community at the turn of the century. In fact, one of the streets in Homewood is called Millionaires Row, Thomas Boulevard. But over the last few years, it's fallen into disrepair for a variety of reasons. And at Pitt, fewer faculty led by John Wallace really want to revitalize the community. And our whole thesis is that by implementing BOH principles in Homewood, we can help revitalize the community. And John's been instrumental in getting us to make this happen. because it's that domain. John's much more familiar with the domain than we are. We also want to see how we could. So there's a couple of demonstration projects in Homewood that we are implementing right now, and many of the people who are helping us implement that are here. We are also looking at developing rural microgrids in Gujarat, India, in collaboration with Ahmedabad University. We want to see. So one of the things we're looking at is how bringing electricity and bringing off-grid solutions to remote villages can dramatically change the quality of life there. And there are and it's all not just altruistic. There's a lot of reverse innovation that we can learn from India. And one of the nice and this whole notion of reverse innovation is fairly recent. It's occurred in the last decade. When I first moved to the United States, when my sisters-in-law would come to visit, they would come and buy the latest electronics from the US. And when I would go to India, or when my wife and I would go to India, we would go and buy Indian spices. Today, the tide has changed, where I go to India to buy the latest Samsung cell phone, and they come here to buy the most unadulterated Indian spices. And I said, the wheel has truly come full circle. And this is true in terms of reverse innovation too. The third point that we want to make out here is that you are sitting in what we believe is the energy capital of the world for multiple reasons. Every nuclear reactor designed in the world has origins in Pittsburgh, the Westinghouse. The first oil well was drilled about 100 miles from here. The largest fossil fuel lab in the world is located 15 miles south of here. Shale, of course, was huge here until the oil prices bottomed out. But Pittsburgh is truly the energy capital of the world without us knowing it. And one of the visions we have is to see if we could transform the region using energy as a starting point, and energy and manufacturing as a starting point, really. So I think I've covered a lot of these aspects. John, anything to add on this?
I guess John will be covering much of this, so I think we could hear.
So we've talked about that. We've talked about the rural DC microgrid. I told you I was going to help catch up.
I want to mention the shipping container thing.
Yeah, so one of the things we're looking at is the possibility of developing these community in a box concepts, where you could take a shipping container in series or in parallel, and effectively have that be the hub of a community, either not just in rural developing countries, but also in developed countries. So one of our visions in Homewood is to see if we can develop off-grid solutions that allow a family to rely, never to visit the grocery store, but to rely on everything that's built in a solar greenhouse.
It's the next slide, actually.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So we are also looking at a couple of offshore sites where we can, take the solutions we develop in Homewood and export them. But in order to do that, we'd have to do a significant amount of frugal engineering. Let me just switch. So so there's a lot of work being done in Homewood with the DC part. We are also seeing how we can transform the community through workforce development. And we helped set up a manufacturing center here about 20 years ago with help from the Department of Commerce, where we take people who can barely add a couple of numbers together, and in 10 weeks or 12 weeks, we give them careers for life. And so we have a center called the Manufacturing Assistance Center. We want to move it to home. We're planning to move it to Homewood, and to leverage the skills that we teach into the local Homewood community and with Westinghouse High School. We are well underway. We developed the manufacturing center in the 1990s. We've funded by the Department of Commerce. It's currently in Harmerville, but we want to move it. The nice thing about the manufacturing center is that the employment rate is 95%. So people go through this 9, 10, 15-week program, and 95% of them get employed for life at salaries starting at $18 to $20 an hour. And our thesis here, and the MAC has been actively involved with the local community. We are hoping to do this in Homewood, and this began because John Wallace, John Camillus and I had a conversation, and John said, why don't you have a center that you have in Hummel, why don't you move it to Homewood now that the DC project is there? And that began a journey that's continued
I still remember that.
successfully. So our vision is to transform Homewood and Western Pennsylvania back into a manufacturing powerhouse using BOH principles. Right now we focus on machinist training. We want to be able to transform that focus into manufacturing of energy equipment, to develop training programs that take people who've been incarcerated, who are on the streets, who don't have a hope in life, get them through a 15-week program, which is a commitment because it's an immersive kind of program, and give them jobs where they're employable for the rest of their lives. This is the building that we're going to move to on 78th Susquehanna Street. This was an old Westinghouse factory that was the soul of Homewood, really. This provided the largest employment for the Homewood community. The building fell into disrepair. When I first visited this building with John Wallace and John Camillus, I was in a bit of a shock, I have to confess, because the windows were all blown out, there was nothing in there. And barely 6 months later, the building is 75% occupied. And what shall I say, there's a lot of energy in that. We want to put together a makerspace as part of the manufacturing center where we reach out to the local Homewood community. And we want to start, and we have existing programs we're working with. We want to develop these new programs built on BOH principles that focus on energy manufacturing. How do you make components that relate to energy? What do we mean by energy manufacturing? It's a whole new idea. It looks like so far things are working, but these are the kind of machines we have at the MAC. And we're excited about possibilities at Homewood, both with the off-grid solution and in manufacturing. And with that, I will
You got us back on time.
turn it back to John, just 4 minutes behind schedule.
Oh, yeah. Actually, Bopaya, maybe could we just show them the video on the...
Yes, let's do that.
Yeah, Christy reminded me of that. Yeah,
So
that's
let's
It is early spring of 2016. This is the Homewood neighborhood, the most livable city in the U.S., Pittsburgh. This is the site of the laboratory that is the first step in implementing the DC HEART initiative of the Business of Humanity project. DC HEART stands for Direct Current for Humanity, Energy and Regional Transformation. The DC HEART initiative was established at the Business of Humanity conference held in Prague in October of 2013. This watershed conference focused on the potential of DC power to energize and uplift low-income communities. What we are looking at here at Homewood is a laboratory that focuses on the use of a disruptive technology to stimulate human and economic development. Disruptive technologies, which are traditionally viewed as threatening existing business models, can also be the foundation of innovative business models. By using new technologies to address basic human needs, the Business of Humanity project seeks to demonstrate the synergy between profits and social benefit. This laboratory is a state-of-the-art, custom-designed off-grid greenhouse that runs on renewable, locally generated, green, and efficient DC power. It is environmentally beneficial. It is expected to cost less than AC power from the grid, and it offers startups, as well as large businesses, opportunities for profit and growth. The greenhouse was selected as the first laboratory for DC power because a greenhouse aligns with the needs of the local community. Homewood is considered a food desert, and the greenhouse directly addresses this concern. This laboratory is the first step in a multi-year plan to introduce green and efficient DC power to homes and institutions, and to create a DC microgrid and related economic activity in Homewood in partnership with the Bible Center Church. This laboratory is expected to stimulate and catalyze entrepreneurial activity in terms of developing hardware and products that will support the DC Heart Initiative. This is the Business of Humanity Project's dream for Western Pennsylvania, that its DC Heart Initiative will improve the quality of life for the people in Homewood, will provide better and more accessible food, will lower utility costs, will serve as a stimulus for manufacturing-oriented, profitable entrepreneurial activity in the region, and will pave the way to making the University, Pittsburgh, and the region important participants in and beneficiaries of the global DC revolution.